You're fired just because of a coffee bill. If you don't follow the rules, you don't belong here.
Let's see how that standard is actually applied. I know exactly what I'm submitting.
I was fired in front of 30 people over $27. Not fraud, not misconduct. Coffee for a client during a delayed meeting, charged according to policy, approved by my manager, logged in the system like everything else I had done for years. Elliot Granger didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He leaned back, folded his hands, and said, "Integrity starts with small things." No one spoke. Screens stayed on, cameras stayed muted. The silence felt procedural, rehearsed, almost polite. I stood there while my career was reduced to a line item smaller than a parking ticket. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I asked one question, carefully neutral, the kind that fits inside corporate language without triggering alarms. Can you confirm that this expense policy is applied consistently across all management levels? That was it. No tone, no edge, just words. I was the senior operations manager, the person who kept the company running when dashboards froze and vendors threatened penalties. I solved problems before executives learned they existed. I knew where the systems bent and where they broke. That was my value. It never showed up on slides. Elliot Granger controlled the slides. As chief financial officer, he owned the policies, the interpretations, and the moral vocabulary. Numbers obeyed him. People adjusted. He liked rules because they moved downward. He said my termination was about standards. He said exceptions weaken culture. He said the board expected discipline. I watched him say all of it without blinking. After the call ended, my access disappeared. My calendar went blank. I packed nothing. I didn't need souvenirs. I went home and wrote a single email. No accusations, no appeals. I quoted the policy. I asked for written clarification on consistency. I thanked compliance for their time. I pressed send and forgot about it. I didn't know the system had already tagged the message. I didn't know it carried a label no executive could delete, policy clarification request. At that moment, the meeting was over, but something far larger had quietly begun moving without anyone's permission inside the company. If your chest feels a little tight, close your eyes for 5 quiet minutes and let the noise fade just enough to steady yourself. I'm curious, where are you listening from right now? Stay with me. And if stories like this speak to you, consider subscribing because what happened next was far colder and far more calculated. Consistency was the word they kept using, and it followed me like an insult I couldn't shake. While Elliot Granger was busy redefining culture in conference rooms, I was usually awake at midnight, patching an operations failure no one wanted to own. I'd sit alone, rerouting shipments, rewriting schedules, calming vendors who were already drafting penalty emails. By morning, dashboards looked clean again. Executives praised resilience. No one asked how close we came to disaster. There was the quarter when a key supplier collapsed 3 days before delivery. Legal froze. Finance panicked. I stepped in, negotiated temporary terms, and kept a 7-figure deal alive without a press release or bonus. Elliot never showed up. He rarely did when something was actually on fire. He appeared later, when the story needed structure, and spoke about principles. That contrast stayed with me after the firing. My contributions didn't vanish, they were rewritten. Suddenly, I wasn't the person who kept things moving. I was a risk, a deviation, a lesson. The day after the meeting, an automated message instructed me to begin immediate handover, not gradual, immediate. My inbox filled with requests for documentation I had written, systems I had stabilized, workflows no one else fully understood, halfway through replying. My access cut out, files locked, calendars disappeared. I watched years of institutional knowledge turn inaccessible in seconds. Elliot, meanwhile, went on a quiet tour. Emails went out praising accountability. A short internal note framed my termination as a necessary step toward cleaner operations. My name wasn't mentioned. My work was absorbed into vague language about improvement. It felt deliberate, like sanding down a history until it fit a preferred narrative. I tried to remember moments that proved I wasn't imagining things. Nights when my phone rang because something broke and no one else answered. Mornings when leadership congratulated itself for outcomes they never touched. Those memories started to feel unstable, like evidence no longer admissible. What bothered me most wasn't losing my job. It was watching consistency weaponized. The same rules that ignored executive habits suddenly became sacred when applied downward. Principle, I realized, was flexible when power needed it to be. Late that afternoon, my phone buzzed with a reply from compliance. The message was brief and politely detached. Your request requires consistency review. Nothing more. No reassurance. No timeline. I reread the line several times. Consistency. Again. Only later would I understand what it meant. A consistency review doesn't stop at one person. It can't. To compare application, you have to open management files, all of them. That wasn't something Elliot announced. It was simply how the system worked once asked the right question. At the time, I only felt the unfairness settling deeper, a quiet pressure building, as if the past I remembered and the story they told were pulling apart, stretching the truth until something had to snap. The realization didn't arrive with drama. It arrived with silence. 2 days after compliance replied, another automated notice appeared in my inbox. No sender name, no greeting, just a reference number and a line stating that the audit committee had been notified as required by procedure. That was when I understood something important. This was no longer a conversation. It was a mechanism. I hadn't filed a complaint. I hadn't accused anyone. I had asked a narrow question about consistency. The system treated that question as an input, not an emotion. Once logged, it followed rules that didn't care who benefited or who suffered. I learned what was happening indirectly. A former colleague messaged me, cautious, almost apologetic. Leadership was scrambling. Elliot Granger had called an emergency meeting with legal and compliance, demanding to know who authorized the review. The answer, apparently, was no one. It was automatic. Elliot tried to reframe it. He argued context. He argued intent. He argued that my termination had already resolved the issue. Compliance declined to debate. Their role wasn't to judge motives, it was to verify application. The policy either applied evenly, or it didn't. There was no middle ground to negotiate. What struck me most was that no one reached out to me. I wasn't being questioned. No interviews, no requests for explanation. I wasn't the subject. I was the reference point. They were comparing decisions, not people. Behind closed doors, the audit committee received system-generated summaries, expense approvals, exceptions, patterns, 3 fiscal years, pulled without preference. The scope widened because it had to prove consistency. You need history. A single quarter wouldn't do. Elliot pushed back hard. He warned about disruption. He warned about reputation. He warned about cost. None of it mattered. The response was procedural and final once triggered. The review could not be suspended by executive request. The safeguards existed precisely to prevent that. That was the moment the cold settled in. I realized the power wasn't in my hands, or Elliot's. It belonged to architecture designed long before either of us. The same system meant to protect the company from risk was now indifferent to hierarchy. Late that evening, another notice arrived. The review period had officially expanded to cover 3 full financial years. Attachments followed, timelines, definitions, next steps. I stared at the screen, understanding that no one could switch this off, not even the people who had written the rules. The process would continue until it finished, untouched by persuasion, fear, or authority, and somewhere inside that quiet inevitability. The balance had already begun to shift. I felt no triumph, only distance, as if watching weather form beyond the horizon. The unfairness that crushed me now fed something impersonal and vast. I understood then that this wasn't revenge. It was gravity, pulling equally on everyone, whether they believed in it or not, any more today. From here, the story begins to change direction. Patterns reveal themselves quietly, but once you see them, they refuse to disappear. The audit didn't start with accusations. It started with spreadsheets. Lines of expenses arranged by date, amount, and approval level. Small numbers repeated across months, then years. The kind you skim past because they look harmless. Coffee, parking, meals logged just under internal thresholds. Those numbers weren't mine. They belonged to executives, individually insignificant, collectively disciplined, always small enough to avoid escalation. Split deliberately, spread carefully, approved with the same casual consistency Elliot Granger demanded from everyone else. That was when my $27 stopped being a joke and became a ruler. Compliance used my expense as the control. Same policy, same category, same threshold, only the outcome differed. Mine ended a career. Theirs blended into routine, side by side. The contrast was impossible to ignore. I heard about the shift through fragments, a manager canceling meetings, a director suddenly unavailable, then a quiet rumor. Legal had been pulled into an emergency session. Elliot was asking questions no one wanted to answer. He wanted limits. He wanted assurances. He wanted this classified as a technical review. The system didn't respond with comfort. It responded with math. The auditors weren't judging intent. They mapped behavior, frequency, timing, approval paths. They flagged expense clusters that hovered just below review thresholds, quarter after quarter. No single entry violated policy. Together, they formed a shape. That shape had weight. I imagined Elliot sitting across from legal, watching the narrative slip away. Principles don't help when patterns replace explanations. The language shifts from administrative to structural, from oversight to design. You can argue mistakes. You can't argue repetition. Late that evening, the first formal note appeared in the audit log. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't name names. It didn't accuse. It simply stated an observation. Pattern indicates systemic behavior. That sentence changed everything. Systemic meant no quick fix, no training memo, no quiet correction. It meant governance failure. It meant responsibility moved upward, not sideways. For the first time since my termination, I felt something other than pressure. It wasn't relief. It was clarity. The numbers were doing what words never could. They were telling the truth without caring who heard it. My $27 sat at the center of it all, unchanged, unarguable, a constant around it. The illusion of consistency collapsed into something measurable. The audit kept moving forward, indifferent and exact. And I understood that whatever came next would no longer be described as an administrative issue ever again. I stayed silent, knowing the cold logic ahead would finish what emotion never could, and that once patterns speak this clearly, even powerful voices lose their privilege to redefine reality, accountability, or escape the consequences they engineered for themselves alone. Power doesn't disappear all at once, it fractures. The first calls didn't come from the company. They came from personal numbers. Late in the afternoon, voices lowered, questions careful. Each executive had retained separate counsel. That alone told me everything. When lawyers stop coordinating, unity is already gone. Elliot Granger felt it next. What had begun as a compliance exercise was now being discussed in terms of exposure, not policy exposure, personal exposure, signatures, certifications, fiduciary duty, words that don't belong to departments, only to individuals. He tried to frame it as a corporate issue, something insurance would absorb. Legal wouldn't promise that anymore. Meetings multiplied and achieved nothing. Directors compared timelines, approvals, email trails. They weren't searching for truth. They were searching for distance. Responsibility became a hot object passed across the table. Each explanation narrowed until it pointed somewhere else. I heard about it through silence. People who used to text stopped. Others sent neutral messages, asking how I was, as if checking whether I might speak. I didn't. I had nothing to add. The process didn't need commentary. It was already documenting everything without me. Elliot's authority thinned in real time. He could demand attendance, but not agreement. He could insist on alignment, but not protection. The more he invoked principle, the more it sounded like cover. Lawyers don't argue values. They argue outcomes. By evening, one director's name started circulating with a new phrase attached: personal reasons, health, family. The standard language of retreat. No accusations, no admissions, just a request to step aside before the record hardened. The board accepted quickly, too quickly. The announcement was brief and respectful, designed to look orderly, but everyone understood what it meant. Someone had calculated the risk and decided the safest move was to remove themselves from the board's perimeter. That was the first domino. Not dramatic, not loud, just a soft, irreversible tilt. The audit continued, unchanged, while power rearranged itself around fear. I stayed quiet, watching the balance shift. For the first time, the rules weren't bending downward, they were standing still. And the people who relied on movement to survive were discovering what happens when there's nowhere left to step. It changed how the room breathed. Emails slowed, decisions stalled, authority asked permission, fear learned to whisper. I recognized the shift because I had lived beneath it for years. Now it climbed upward, searching for shelter. No one celebrated, no one apologized. They adjusted, recalculated, protected themselves. The machine kept turning, indifferent, precise, and patient. I understood then that silence was my strongest position because the record spoke clearly enough, and every new move only confirmed what the numbers had already decided. Nothing followed but consequences, unfolding methodically, without mercy, permission, or rescue. For anyone. Most people stop here, but the truth lies in the next part. Resignations arrived without sound, like doors opening somewhere you weren't meant to notice. The first followed quietly, then another, then another. 3 directors submitted notices within days, each citing personal reasons, each departure processed with clinical efficiency. No farewell emails, no town halls. Their names simply vanished from calendars and distribution lists, leaving behind gaps no one addressed aloud. The company said nothing. There were no statements about restructuring or gratitude for years of service. Silence was safer. Silence avoided questions. Everyone understood what was happening. Even as leadership pretended nothing had changed, Elliot Granger remained. He still chaired meetings, still spoke about stability, still believed he controlled the narrative. He framed the exits as coincidences, unfortunate timing, unrelated decisions. He repeated that audits were routine, that nothing indicated wrongdoing. He sounded convincing to people who needed him to be behind the scenes. The audit advanced untouched. No announcements, no leaks, just steady movement through approvals and expense trails. The absence of noise made it worse. Consequences were unfolding without ceremony, without anyone to argue against. I watched from a distance, detached in a way that surprised me. There was no anger left, only a quiet satisfaction that didn't need recognition. I hadn't won anything. I hadn't spoken a word. The system was resolving an imbalance I had lived with for years. What struck me was how quickly loyalty dissolved. Executives who once defended each other now focused inward. Each resignation narrowed Elliot's circle. Each empty seat made the room colder. Authority doesn't vanish. It isolates. By the end of the week, 4 chairs sat vacant. The audit hadn't released a report. No conclusions had been shared. Yet the outcome was already visible. Structure had shifted. Power had thinned. Elliot stood alone at the center of it, insisting he was steady. Insisting this was temporary. He was the last one left, surrounded by absence, still convinced the story belonged to him. I understood then that the most effective consequences arrive quietly. No confrontation, no celebration. Just empty spaces where certainty used to sit, and a process continuing forward, indifferent to who remained standing. It felt cold, but satisfying. The kind of justice that doesn't ask for applause. I thought about the meeting where $27 erased me, and how quietly the scales had moved since. No speeches, no reversals, just absence doing its work. I didn't smile. I didn't feel joy. I felt balance returning, slowly, inevitably. As the system kept counting, nothing was announced yet, but everything had changed, and I knew the last man standing would soon realize that silence, once ignored, had rewritten the ending he thought he controlled, without permission, without mercy, without anyone left to blame from consequences alone. Tension doesn't announce itself, it tightens. The shift became unmistakable when Elliot Granger's name started appearing everywhere in the audit extracts. Not once or twice, but consistently his signature attached to approvals at every sensitive junction, expense exceptions, threshold overrides, final authorizations that closed loops others had opened. The pattern wasn't aggressive. It was thorough. That's when Elliot stopped pretending this was routine. He pushed back publicly. Choosing language meant to unsettle the process. He suggested bias. He implied personal motivation. He framed the review as retaliation, disguised as governance. It was a risky move, and everyone in the room knew it. Audits don't respond well to accusations. They respond with documentation. The audit committee requested a formal explanation, not a discussion, not a call, a written response, timed, structured, logged. Elliot tried to reclaim ground by force of presence. He spoke about intent, about oversight burdens, about the reality of executive workflow. He argued that leadership requires discretion, that someone has to make judgment calls. He never denied the signatures. He reframed them as responsibility. The committee didn't debate him. They listened, took notes, and asked for supporting records. That silence was heavier than resistance. Behind it, compliance continued its work. Unaffected, they weren't mapping personalities. They were tracing authority. Every decision flowed through Elliot's desk, and the system recognized that concentration as risk. Governance models assume distribution. What they found was accumulation. I stayed invisible, watching the tension climb without relief. The language changed again, no longer about consistency. Now it was about exposure. The question was no longer whether policy had been applied unevenly, but whether safeguards had been bypassed by design. Late in the day, another notice circulated. The audit committee had voted to place Elliot on administrative leave pending completion of review. No adjectives, no commentary, just a procedural outcome. The room froze. Minutes later, a follow-up appeared. Effective immediately, Elliot's signing authority was suspended. Temporary, precautionary, standard. That was the line he couldn't cross back over. Authority isn't the title, it's the ability to act. And in that moment, Elliot still had his office, his email, his status, but not his signature. Decisions stopped at his desk and went nowhere. Meetings continued without him. His presence became symbolic, then irrelevant. I felt the tension release all at once, like pressure escaping a sealed room. Not relief, not triumph, just recognition. The system had reached a point of no return, and it didn't care who felt wronged by it. For years, Elliot had believed control came from interpretation. Now interpretation was gone. Only records remained. I realized then that the signature he used to erase me had finally trapped him in place, immobilized by the very authority he once exercised without hesitation, and there was nothing left for him to argue against except time, which had already stopped listening. You will want to stay until the end to hear this part. The report arrived without warning, the way final decisions usually do. There was no preamble, no press language, no attempt to soften what it contained. It was a document built for records, not reactions. Page after page of findings, cross-references, timelines. When I reached the conclusion, I noticed what wasn't there. The word fraud never appeared, neither did corruption or misconduct. Instead, a single phrase sat at the center, repeated with careful precision: failure of fiduciary consistency. It was colder than any accusation. The report didn't argue motives. It didn't speculate intent. It documented outcomes. Authority concentrated where it shouldn't have been. Safeguards applied unevenly. Oversight exercised selectively. In governance terms, that was enough. Personal ethics didn't matter when institutional duty failed. The board convened the same afternoon. No observers, no extended discussion. The vote was procedural, almost mechanical. Once the findings were acknowledged, the options narrowed quickly. Keeping Elliot Granger in place would have implied acceptance. Removing him restored distance. I wasn't in the room, but I knew how it unfolded. Votes cast quietly. A decision reached without drama. Legal language chosen to close doors rather than open them. Elliot was informed immediately. He tried once more to negotiate. He pointed to years of service, to stability maintained, to risks avoided. He argued that the findings were technical. That perception could be managed. The board didn't respond to any of it. They didn't need to. The report had already done the work. By evening, the outcome circulated internally. Elliot was asked to resign effective that day. No transition period. No extended handover. The language was respectful, but final. What surprised people most came after. There was no severance package, no consulting agreement, no quiet payout to smooth the exit. The findings made that impossible. Fiduciary failure doesn't qualify for graceful compensation. The board couldn't justify it, and legal wouldn't recommend it. The man who once spoke about small numbers and big principles left with neither. I read the notice twice, not because I doubted it, but because it felt unreal how clean it was. No raised voices, no spectacle, just removal. The justice in it wasn't emotional. It didn't celebrate me or restore what I lost. It corrected an imbalance with precision, then moved on. I felt something settle in my chest, not relief, but acceptance. This was how systems were meant to work when they weren't bent. Elliot's resignation closed a chapter without apology or forgiveness. The process didn't need either. It had reached its conclusion, indifferent to pride, reputation, or regret. And for the first time since that meeting over $27, the rules stood exactly where they claimed to belong. I returned to the building without ceremony, which felt right. The invitation didn't frame itself as an apology. It arrived as a proposal, precise and understated, outlining a new role focused on operational oversight and policy alignment. No mention of the past. No emotional language. Just an acknowledgement that systems needed someone who understood how they actually functioned. When I walked back in, people nodded the way they do when a conclusion has already been reached. There were no whispers, no congratulations. My desk wasn't the same, but the work was familiar. The company had moved forward, and so had I. The first visible change appeared in an all-hands memo. The expense policy was revised and republished, clarified line by line. Thresholds adjusted, language tightened, application explicitly uniform across levels. It wasn't dramatic, but it was unmistakable. Consistency was no longer a slogan. It was documented. No one mentioned $27, not in meetings, not in jokes, not in passing. The number disappeared, stripped of its power. It no longer belonged to anyone. What surprised me most was how quickly the air changed. Decisions felt cleaner. Approvals moved faster, not slower. Fear retreated. People asked questions again. The system, once corrected, stopped grinding its edges against everyone inside it. Late one afternoon, I opened my archived messages and found the email. The one I had sent without expectation. Neutral subject, neutral language, a simple request for clarification. I read it carefully, searching for something reckless or naive. There was nothing to change. A week later, compliance reached out. They asked permission to reference that message in internal training. Not as a warning, as an example, a demonstration of how policy questions should be raised and how systems are supposed to respond when they are. I agreed. The loop closed quietly. No announcement, no ceremony. Just alignment restored. It felt like exhaling after holding tension for too long. Not dramatic, not celebratory, just steady. I noticed how my shoulders lowered, how conversations no longer carried hidden tests. The injustice that once pressed inward finally released, replaced by something quieter: permission to move forward without needing to prove I had survived it. That clarity mattered more than any apology ever could from the people involved. I understood then that dignity doesn't always come back through confrontation. Sometimes it returns through recognition. When the record speaks clearly enough that no one needs to explain it, I hadn't been vindicated by words. I'd been restored by process. The company corrected itself. I reclaimed my place without resentment, and the email that started everything remained exactly as it was, unchanged. Now, teaching others how power should be questioned and how fairness survives when systems are allowed to do their work, fully and without interference. I didn't feel victory when it was over. I felt alignment. What stayed with me wasn't Elliot Granger's exit or the empty chairs that followed. It was the quiet certainty that nothing extraordinary had happened. No clever trick, no revenge. Just a system doing exactly what it was designed to do once it was allowed to run. People later asked if it was about the money. $27? I told them no. It never was. It was the rule they believed only applied to others, and the moment that belief collided with structure, there were no celebrations, no speeches, no dramatic reversals. I didn't need closure from anyone who had benefited from imbalance. Their silence was enough. The record spoke clearly without emotion, and that clarity was final. What satisfied me wasn't watching power fall. It was watching restraint return. Policies stopped bending. Exceptions stopped hiding. Questions stopped feeling dangerous. The organization didn't become perfect. It became predictable, and that mattered more. I learned something important through all of it. Systems don't care about intent, charisma, or reputation. They respond to inputs, ask the right question, and they move. Try to dominate them, and they eventually resist. Fairness isn't enforced by anger, it's enforced by design. I didn't walk away richer or louder. I walked away steady. My name was no longer attached to a warning or a lesson. It belonged where it always had, in the work itself. The ending wasn't cinematic. It was clean. The kind of justice that leaves no scars because it doesn't swing wildly. It corrects, then settles. If there is a moral here, it isn't about standing up or striking back. It's about understanding leverage that doesn't announce itself. Rules written carefully matter more than rules shouted loudly. And consistency, once demanded honestly, cannot be selectively withdrawn. I returned to my life without bitterness. The pressure was gone, the balance restored. Nothing burned, nothing exploded. Everything simply fell back into place. That was enough for me. Because in the end, it was never about $27. It was about whether the rules belonged to everyone or only to the people who thought they were untouchable. I didn't need their regret, their explanations, or their apologies to move forward. The process had already done the only thing that mattered. It restored proportion. Power met limits, rules met reality, and accountability arrived without shouting. That kind of ending doesn't fade. It stays, quiet and exact, reminding anyone watching that fairness isn't fragile. It simply waits, patient, until someone believes it no longer applies. And then it proves, calmly, that it always does. Nothing else needs explanation, because the system already delivered justice with precision, restraint, and permanence without spectacle, cruelty, noise, fear, doubt, delay. This story reminded me that fairness doesn't always arrive loudly, but it always leaves a mark. Sometimes, the strongest response isn't anger, but patience and clarity. As you listened, how did it make you feel? Would you change the ending? Or did this quiet justice feel right to you? I'd genuinely love to know where you're listening from right now. If this story resonated, please leave a comment, tap like, share it with someone who might need it, and consider subscribing. Your support helps these stories keep finding the right ears.